Now I'm going to introduce Karen from Deloitte, who spoke earlier, but she's the Research Director for Deloitte's UK Centre for Health Solutions and has been in post there since December 2011. Karen, over to you.
Just checking you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. And good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to present a very high-level overview of our research that led us to do a series of reports on the role of AI in transforming the biopharma value chain. So I'm just briefly going to touch on a report we've done for 10 years now that looks at measuring the return from pharma innovation and the return on investment for that companies, and we're talking here about the large pharma companies are seeing, and then briefly discuss some of the use cases of AI in both drug discovery and clinical trials. So what we've been seeing through our report measuring the return from pharma innovation is that there's been a steady decline in the return on investment, as seen from the amount of money that is spent on funding research and clinical development, and then the expected revenue you can achieve on launch from selling those drugs. And as you can see here, the decline in return on investment has been quite alarming for both the original cohort of the top 12 pharma companies by spend on research and development, which is the green line. And then we added in 2013 some smaller but more agile companies who were focusing on a narrower range of therapy areas. And whilst they enjoyed very much higher rates of return in the earlier days that they were involved in our research, we have seen their return on investment decline as well, as they've actually become more like the big companies in our cohort. But overall, what you see is the cost of clinical trials, and we've already discussed it, increasing from 1.2 billion to 2 billion in those 10 years, and the expected revenue that could be achieved on average per asset halving. And we go into lots of reasons why that is, but what it shows is that the model of R&D is generally broken. One of the biggest drivers of cost is the length of clinical trials, and it's already been alluded to here. But on average, the clinical trial cycle times have been increasing, and it's particularly the case for oncology. And on the other side of it, oncology is making up an increasing percentage of the pipeline of the companies in our cohort. So that combination of increasing length of clinical trials, and that's despite an increasing number of assets having special designation, which are intended, those early access programs to get drugs to patients more quickly. But all of these things are why something needed to change. So we set off on this series of reports that looked at the intelligent clinical trials, intelligent drug discovery, but we did an overview report as well that looked at some of those cross-cutting themes. And I already mentioned interoperability and data and the role of data in being able to apply AI, and we cover them in our overview report. But because of the time available today, I'm just going to focus on drug discovery and again at a very high level, and clinical trials, and then finish with just looking at what this might mean for the future. So in drug discovery, which hasn't really been touched on, but is that very first stage of the clinical development process, it can reduce the timelines for drug discovery. And there are some examples that we feature in our reports, some case examples, where drug discovery has been reduced to a matter of weeks rather than years. The average time for drug discovery is about 5 to 6 years. AI has the potential to reduce that time, potential to increase the accuracy of the predictions about the efficacy and safety of drugs, which will then have a benefit during clinical trials itself. So many drugs fail clinical trials due to the efficacy and safety issues, but because of the increased insights from using AI in drug discovery, you can have more certainty over whether or not they will be likely to fail the clinical trial. And then the improved opportunity to diversify drug pipelines. AI-enabled prediction tools improve in speed and precision of discovery, and of preclinical testing, and opening up new research lines. And we've seen that coming to the fore during the past 12 months or so in repurposing drugs for COVID that had been developed and approved for other uses. And of course, that applies to many other therapy areas. And then the traditional approach to clinical development. Said it's a lengthy process. We've heard that from other speakers today. But on average, it's 10 to 12 years, and only about 10% of drugs that enter clinical trials actually end up being approved for use in the patient population. So in our report on the use of AI in drug discovery, we have examples at each of the phases of how AI can help improve the speed and accuracy of these phases. But again, I can't discuss them in detail because we don't have time. But the cost drivers of clinical trials, and we've again heard other presenters mention patient recruitment. Patient recruitment is there, that's the biggest cost driver. Outsourcing costs are the next biggest, and then as you just go around that circle, site recruitment, clinical trial management, site retention, because not only can we lose patients from trials, but we can also lose sites, data management and validation, and of course, patient retention. So this is analysis of lots of different secondary research reports on the cost drivers of clinical trials. So the winds of change, using AI to design the clinical trials of the future. The future is with us, as we've been hearing, but this is at scale. And in order to adopt clinical AI-enabled technology, there are a number of barriers that do need to be overcome. But the benefits will be in optimizing patient and site selection and recruitment, improving the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the trial process, but also optimizing the design and startup and closeout of trials, and that documentation that needs to go alongside the running of a clinical trial that can be very complex to pull together. And that often does delay the trial because of being able to satisfy the regulator with enough evidence of safety and efficacy. So improving the quality and process of dossier submission is also a role for AI. And then, as we've heard, improving patient engagement, adherence, and dropouts through the use of AI, which is what previous speakers have focused on. But all of these options can really improve the length of clinical trials. And whilst the vaccine development is a specific case in point, there has been a lot of collaboration to bring data together to enable some of these technologies to be applied to help speed up that process. So the applications of AI across the different phases of trial design and execution are in all of these spaces here, from advanced data analytics and AI automation across trial design, startup, conduct, and closeout, but also in that patient engagement, patient monitoring, patient support. So all of these areas have the potential to benefit from the use of AI technologies. But I'd like to stress that it's not about the technology per se, it's about change management in adopting these technologies to change the way that trials are conducted and the way that they are viewed as part of this ecosystem. So in terms of the future of biopharma over the next decade, a lot, as we say in our drug discovery report, still 90% of the drugs in the pipeline are small molecules, and they are less complex than the biologics and that we are seeing increasingly. And when I talked about cancer in clinical trials, they tend much more to be in the biologic space, and they're the ones that are more complex and therefore are driving the length of trials. But R&D costs will shift from that traditional discovery, which takes up about a quarter to a third of costs, to execution and to a process driven by large data sets. Scientific breakthroughs as a result of the insights gained by applying AI to all of this data that's been talked about will also help improve that our discovery and the new science as we go through the next few years. And then, of course, the importance of advanced analytics. I'm going to finish on a report we published at the end of last year, which was done during, as I say, during the last 3 months of the year. So the impact of COVID was pretty well known by then. So, and we looked at what was happening in clinical trials. And our prediction is that in 5 years, companies will have reversed the decline in the returns from pharma R&D. that advanced AI analytics and AI-enabled technologies will have accelerated drug discovery and clinical trials and improve the efficiency and efficacy of trial design and satisfying the regulators, as well as reducing costs. It does require some barriers to be overcome, and some of the barriers that need to be addressed, and they cut across all our predictions, are the need for new skills and talent. And we heard a mention of the importance of having clinical informaticians. The same is true of pharma companies having data scientists and other technology-enabled skill sets. And actually scientists becoming not just very adept at the science, but also at the data side of things. So pharma R&D processes are augmented through digital platforms enabled by access to fair data systems and processes, and signing up to those standards that are really important here. The research partnerships with academia and digital tech companies, driven by leaders with digital skills and a fail early, fail fast mindset, which is not something that has been a real feature of clinical trial design in the past. So that digital leadership, that digital skill sets are really important at the board level, and AI-enabled skill sets as well. AI for drug discovery companies is something that have grown significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. And they're different to previous companies who support the clinical trial processes in that they don't necessarily want to just help discover a new drug and then be acquired and move on to the next company. They actually want to see and be partners to the clinical trial process throughout the clinical development. We've seen a real increase in the number of AI for drug discovery companies. When we did our intelligent drug discovery report, there were about 170 registered. There are now over 300 and growing. And they bring a particularly adept skill set into this whole equation. But pharma companies employing those data-rich visualization tools we've already heard about in our case examples this morning, and developing hub and spoke command centers to operate virtual clinical trials. And of course, the importance of wearables, e-consent platforms and telehealth, which are not just transforming healthcare, but will transform the clinical trials of the future. I'll just say a little bit about regulation. I mentioned skills and talent as being both an enabler of the future, but a barrier that needs to be overcome. The other two are new business and financial models, because different ways of funding the whole process of clinical trials is critical, but also a new regulatory paradigm. And finally, a digital data sharing and security and interoperability issues. But not a lot has been said so far this morning about regulation. So as I say, regulation runs across all of our predictions, but in terms of achieving this particular prediction, the future of regulation requires rapid changes to the regulatory response. And we've seen that during COVID. It's created new relationships with regulators and pharma companies. Academia and the role of academia has also come to the fore. And so these partnerships and collaborations are, for me, one of the most important developments we've seen during COVID. And we heard that in our last presentation, that impressive collaboration that we've seen in Manchester. So I'm going to finish here, but again, mention that in our predictions reports, we do have case examples of how companies are already using and pushing at the forefront of the use of AI in clinical trials and the digital transformation of clinical drug discovery and development. And these are just two examples from our report. And as I've said, you've heard some today. But in terms of COVID, I just want to mention 23andMe and the way that it pivoted its research platform to identify a number of genetic and non-genetic associations for susceptibility and severity to COVID-19. And in less than 4 months was able to recruit 1 million of their customers consented to participate in the research. And I'd like to echo what we've already been said, that patients are willing to participate in trials if they know about them and are given the opportunity. And all too often in the past, it's knowing about them and having that opportunity. But the other final input thing I'll say is feeding back to patients the results of clinical trials. Having this very much data-driven approach allows you to have the bespoke reports that you can feedback to the patients to encourage further participation in clinical trials. I'm going to leave it there, but I've covered quite a lot of reports in that, and all the reports are available on our website. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Karen. I believe we now have a poll, a kind of audience poll ready to go, which if you could vote on that, and then we're going to move on to our final speaker for the day, who is Adrian Tujungi, who is a partner for Taylor Wissing. So if you vote in that poll, and then I'll hand over to Adrian. So do you have any form of AI already implemented in the clinical systems you use? Yes, 26%, no, 61%, 13% don't know. Interesting what we can take away from that. Adrian.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I'm just going to bring up my presentation. Right. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to speak to you. We've got 5 minutes, I think, at the end of the session. I'll keep my remarks to that, or try to. And this is picking up on what Karen has just been talking about, the regulatory aspect. In particular, what changes have we seen over the last 12 months since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic? And to the extent we can, how has that changed the regulatory environment and the willingness by regulators to accept into the clinical trial paradigm and embed within GCP the types of technology that we've been talking about? So very quickly, I think the first slide I've got is looking at clinical trial authorization, and just some of the key developments we've seen over the last 12 months here in terms of trial setup and authorization. So here in the UK, the Health Research Authority back in March 2020 very quickly responded to the pandemic outbreak here in the UK and established a regulatory fast track approval, both for Research Ethics Committee approval and research approval within the NHS. Studies which, following an element of pre-screening, were classified as urgent public health studies were going to be approved or reviewed within 24 hours, and then given the go-ahead or otherwise. And then there were some other priority topics which have been updated continually in the last 12 months. So initially there were various criteria. They were reviewed within a 36 to 72-hour time frame. Those current priority topics involve things like vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics for COVID, so studies relating to those, studies also relating to prevalence and transmissibility, and I think studies relating to aspects of the immune system as well. So those are the current priority topics where you can get that type of fast track approval. MHRA, as regards clinical trials of investigation medicinal products, again, back in March 2020, put forward a fast track. In effect, they were going to prioritize review and approval of trials which were involved in COVID-19. The Commission, obviously the EMA had been doing similar things, and we don't have time in the slot that's available to me to look in detail at what the EMA and the FDA were doing in parallel, but they were going through a very similar process. Interestingly, for those of you who are involved in cell and gene therapy, as one of the presenters was talking about earlier, and in particular also vaccine trials as well, where there may be viral vectors involved. In July 2020, the European legislator came up with a new regulation, which again removed some regulatory barriers, some of the difficulties caused by the GMO legislation here in Europe to trial initiation, particularly for vaccines and other types of gene-modified cell therapy, were disapplied for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic or public health emergency. This regulatory flexibility and speed of response allowed over 200 trials to be initiated between March and April 2020, according to the data in UGCT, and the number of clinical trials has clearly grown significantly since then. And this has been a successful and popular fast track approach. Our contacts within clinicians and I think more widely throughout the CT sector have thought that this is a scheme that they want to try and keep. to the extent it can be resourced and staffed appropriately by the regulators. If we look at the impact of the pandemic on the management of ongoing clinical trials, so at the time of the outbreak, there were approximately 4,000 non-COVID-19 trials underway. And patient organisations have reported that there was considerable alarm and concern among the trial subjects for a number of reasons. Clearly, lockdown rules meant that in principle, it was unlawful for patients to do site visits. Access to hospitals themselves were not allowing patients in to prevent transmission. It was possible that your PI became ill and had to go off, self-isolate, couldn't take part in the trial any longer. Staff, both in terms of clinicians and nurses, were being redeployed to the front line. Lab capacity was being, wherever possible, diverted to help with diagnostics. And there'd been significant supply chain disruption for the medicinal product itself, and in particular, where that involved cross-border supply chains, the closing down of flights, the requirement for logistics drivers to self-isolate when they cross borders, that all meant that it was quite difficult to ensure that you had your trial supplies in the right place at the right time. The regulators that we've talked about, the MHRA, the HRA, the Human Tissue Authority as well, and then the European EMA and the FDA, all produced guidance in very short order on what sponsors and host organizations, PIs as well, should do in terms of managing trials. They've all shown a lot of flexibility, and in some cases, actually, they've regulatory forbearance or regulatory lenience to say that they'll exercise discretion not to enforce powers in certain circumstances. That guidance has been updated continually over the last 12 months as the situation has evolved. And most of the guidance documents are expressly marked as temporary. So when we speculate how much of the approach that we've seen over the last 12 months will remain in place when the pandemic comes to an end, that is at the moment speculation. But I think what we can say is regulators have been forced to show a lot of willingness and engage with some of the technologies we've been talking about today. And through that familiarity and through that contact, they would have built familiarity. And it's inevitable that they will be much more receptive to those type of technologies going forward. Safety of trial subjects throughout has been the priority. Data integrity, of course, is still important, data quality, but the priority has been safety of patients and in enabling patients to continue in trials, particularly where the trial is in many cases the only hope for the patient. If we look in a bit more detail at what some of the guidance has suggested that hosts and PIs should be doing, generally speaking, that there was a four-prong approach. The options were to halt recruitment into a trial, say pause the trial, continue the trial, but with appropriate risk mitigation, which normally involve different approaches to delivery. And this is where we link back to Manoj's presentation and what John McRae was saying earlier about decentralized clinical trials. Now, some of this is pretty low tech, replacing hospital visits with tele or video consultations. That doesn't really touch on AI or some of the technology platforms we've been talking about earlier. Assessments, so you can do your testing, your lab tests using outside labs where there's capacity available rather than hospital labs, supplying the trial drug to the trial subject at home or increasing pack size. So again, all of that would clearly be subject to an assessment of, is it the type of drug that can be self-administered? Are there any cold chain requirements? Is it a controlled substance? So does it need to be tracked from a sort of chain of custody point of view and recovered to the extent it's not administered? All of those issues would need to be assessed as part of the risk mitigation, but the regulator was in principle open to the trial protocol being amended in those regards. And then clearly you have to bring your paperwork up to date. So in many cases, amendments had to be submitted, but most of the changes the regulators were willing to view as non-substantial. Again, that interesting to see whether that categorization would continue after the end of the pandemic. But what that meant was, whilst they had to be filed, they didn't need to be pre-approved before they could be implemented. And then the other two options were obviously to stop or suspend the trial. I think the data that we've seen, and anecdotally, that didn't happen to a great extent, particularly between March and May 2020. There were some trials which were stopped. but then they were restarted. I think the number of trials which completely fell over, certainly when I think about sort of industry-sponsored trials, and particularly those sponsored by the biotech sector, where I spend a lot of my time and where a lot of my clients are, they reported that their biggest concern was that just the duration of the trial was going to be pushed out rather than that the trial was going to be completely cancelled. From a sponsor's point of view, some of the questions have been picking up these questions about monitoring, audit obligations, also remote source data verification. How could that be done? And interestingly, we saw an evolution in some of the regulatory guidance that came out, particularly around things like source data verification, where initially, and if I just flip on to my last slide, initially the EMA was only willing to consider that for trials related to COVID-19 or serious or life-threatening conditions where they lacked other treatment options. And then 6 months later, they updated their guidance to be a lot more permissive about remote source data verification. And clearly, from a regulatory point of view and a GDPR point of view, there are still concerns, in particular about is the particular data to which the sponsor or the monitor is being given access, has it been appropriately anonymized? Has it been appropriately consented? Those type of issues remain to the fore, but the EMA was even willing to say that they, in principle, as long as they've got the right contract clauses in place, they don't mind somebody having access even from outside the EU or the EEA to data within the EU. So that sort of traditional red flag about cross-border data transfers, that they were willing to allow that type of access. But again, there was quite a lot of guidance around how you can do this in practice. You're not allowed to take screenshots. If you access the patient records, then are they appropriately anonymized so the sponsor's not seeing the identity of the patient? Quite a lot of guidance was given around there. And so I'll just finish with the thought about, well, what will the regulatory legacy be? It's difficult to say. I think, as I say, quite a lot of the amendments to trials which have been done on the hoof have been quite low tech. But clearly, some of the trials which have been started from scratch for COVID-19, as we've been hearing, have involved much more significant advances in technology. The regulator over the last 12 months will have been immersed in those. And I think we can expect to see a continued flexibility and continued willingness, particularly pushed by industry and clinicians in both regards. I think the regulator will be willing to continue to see those technologies employed in clinical trials work, and they won't require a return to the status quo ante. And I'll draw stumps at that point, finish my remarks there.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was really great. Do we have any questions? Any sort of questions that have either been unanswered or that people would like to raise off the back of that? I think we are a little bit over time, so I'm sort of somewhat loath to go on much further. But if there's kind of anything really relevant, otherwise, I think we have a sort of a final kind of concluding poll to go to everyone who's still with us. So perhaps we could get that live. So are you considering the use of a remote clinical trials over the next 6 months? Yay or nay? Sandy, would you like to kind of have a few sort of closing words to wrap things up? I think it has been a really very informative and I think detailed session this morning with lots of kind of great engagement as well. And I think lots of good questions, and I'm sure there's a lot to follow up on in future sessions as well, which is always very encouraging to see. I think one of the worst things is when you sort of turn up some of these online sessions and people don't have anything to say, but that's certainly not been the issue this morning.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom, and thanks for moderating so well today. So thank you very much for that. I found the event really informative. I hope the audience did too. I know we have gone a bit over, but I think given what we tried to cover in such a short space of time, I guess that was probably inevitable to some degree. I saw the Q&A was really active. And if your question wasn't answered, please do reach out to us afterwards. We'd be more than happy to help and put you in contact with the right panelists who'll be able to answer your questions for you. This was recorded, So we will share the recording with everyone as well. And beyond that, I'd really like to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences and their knowledge. I hope everyone found it useful. I know I did. And as I said, thanks again, and appreciate you all attending.
Thank you very much, everyone. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.